Today we're going to do an introduction to evolutionary theory. Where else to start our discussion other than Charles Darwin, born in 1809 to 1882. He made most of his key observations during a 5-year voyage aboard the HMS Beagle during 1831 to 1836. And this is my favorite quote of Darwin's. It's actually painted at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C. in their brand new dinosaur exhibit. And he says, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." There's so much in that statement, and that's why I just love it so much. He was very ahead of his time with his ideas, but as we'll learn in the coming slides, he wasn't the first one to make some key observations that led to discussions about evolution. So even though we give all of the credit for evolutionary theory to Charles Darwin, he actually was not the first person to see that species change through time. So first, we need to talk about one of the very earliest mentions of evolution, which was actually made in Basra, Iraq, by a scholar by the name of Al-Jahi, born in 1776 AD. And he composed this book called The Book of Animals, and in it he writes this: "In sum, no animal can survive without nourishment. The hunting animal cannot escape being hunted. Every weak animal devours those that are weaker. Every strong animal cannot avoid being consumed by those that are stronger. God, in sum, made some beings the cause of life to others, and in turn made these cause of death to yet others." So even then, we had the explanation of biological and ecological interactions that drive fitness in a population. Those terms were not used, of course, but still here we can see the contours of that argument being formed. The idea of evolution also might have links way back to Aristotle and his great chain of being that he wrote about. And his views on species have to do with being able to rise on the chain of being. And so the great chain of being is a hierarchical structure, meaning there's one level on top of another level on top of another level. So the hierarchical structure of all matter and life, thought in medieval Christianity to have been decreed by God. The chain starts with God and progresses downward towards angels, then humans, animal, plants, and then minerals. So that was Aristotle's take. And finally, we have the writings of Muqaddimah, an Arab scholar in the 14th century, located in Tunisia, North Africa. And this scholar writes, "Creation started from the minerals and progressed in an ingenious, gradual manner to plants and animals. The last stage of minerals is connected with the first stage of plants, such as herbs and seedless plants. The last stage of plants, such as palms and vines, is connected with the first stage of animals, such as snails and shellfish. The last stage of each group is fully prepared to become the first stage of the next group." So this kind of hints towards that hierarchical structure that Aristotle was talking about in the great chain of being. So all of this leads us to the first fully formed idea on evolution. And this first official explanation was provided from Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, lived 1744 to 1829. And he proposed this idea called inheritance of acquired characteristics. That means acquired during the animal's lifetime and then passed on to progeny or offspring. And the best example for discussing inheritance of acquired characteristics is the giraffe's neck. So the idea here is that the giraffe's neck became so elongated because of the inherent need to reach high brush and trees. So the ancestor of our modern day giraffe would have looked something like this, perhaps, with a short, stubby neck. And through the need to reach higher and higher and higher, we keep stretching that neck to reach leaves higher until eventually we get this progression to this very long neck that we observe today in modern derived organisms. So that is, in essence, the idea of acquired characteristics. But we know that this is not true because, number one, someone who is a bodybuilder during their lifetime, trains their muscles all day, does not give birth to progeny that is inherently a muscle man. Okay, so those muscle-bounded humans do not give birth to babies that are muscle-bound. So that's one obvious example, but someone actually tested the idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics, and that is August Weismann. Weismann tested this directly by manipulating mice. So he cut off the tails of 22 generations of mice just to see if the succeeding generations of those tailless mice would be tailless. But in fact, all of the offspring, after the parents had their tails chopped off, all of the offspring developed the long tail trait. So this disproved Lamarck's acquired characteristics idea. Had there been offspring who from the womb were born with short tails because their mother and father had short tails, then that would have lended credence or evidence to the idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics. But this was a direct refutation of that idea. So Darwin did not come up with the idea of evolution, not even close. This was already on people's minds way, way back. And we're actually only hitting the highlights of the history of evolution today. There's much more to be spoken about. But people like Lamarck and many others had been discussing evolution specifically for many, many years and generations. And obviously scholars from all over the world had an interest in describing the natural world around them. And so invariably, evolution came to the front of their minds. So the question is, what does Darwin actually deserve credit for? And the answer is natural selection. So now let's talk about Darwin's voyage of the Beagle. As we said previously, he spent many, many years on HMS Beagle. He was hired as the naturalist on the crew. He had plans to go to seminary school and be a preacher, but he decided that his curiosity for the natural world was taking him in a different direction. So he was hired on as a naturalist, which back then means someone who had a great interest in all things in the natural world. So he was a geologist, he was a biologist. He really enjoyed marrying the two fields together to explain what he was seeing on his voyage. And there's a quote here when he was making observations of the biota in the environment. He said, "Many of these creatures so low in the scale of nature are most exquisite in their forms and rich colors. It creates a feeling of wonder that so much beauty should be apparently created for such little purpose." In other words, why bother having so much diversity? And Darwin made some key observations during his voyage. His key observations included some that were geological in nature. He also made key observations about the South American mammals. He made key observations in bird beaks, otherwise known as Darwin's finches. And then finally, he brought those observations back to something that he was more comfortable with at home in breeding domestic animals. So first, let's talk about the geology. Geologists love to claim that Darwin was a geologist first and foremost. And yes, I suppose that he was. So he noticed that fossil shells in beds far from the sea resembled modern shellfish, which is very interesting. But he also noticed that those shells got more similar to modern forms the younger the rocks were. So there appeared to be a succession in the types of shells that were in the rocks he was studying, from more primitive forms in older rocks to more derived modern forms in present day rocks. Next, let's talk about South American mammals. Darwin noticed that extinct South American mammals looked pretty similar to local living forms, and direct comparison of fossils, such as this one here, which is a fossil Glyptodon, suggests that we have modern descendants that take a pretty different form. So here we have this version of what we would call an armadillo, but notice that it's massive. It would tower over us if we were to encounter it. But today's allied group, the Panachypus, are very small and low to the ground. So this suggests that there was some sort of evolutionary event or progressive smallification of the mammals he was observing. Same story for the sloths. Here is a fossil ground sloth that lived during the Eocene to the Holocene. And again, notice that it is just towering over any modern representatives of the sloths that we have here, which could just fit in your lap like a cat. So we cannot talk about Darwin's observations without bringing up Darwin's finches, or birds of the Galapagos Islands. Here, close to Ecuador, just off the Ecuadorian coast, Darwin eventually noticed that the beaks of birds on neighboring islands were similar, but they had differences between the species, like differences in shape and size. And he also noticed that those different finches with different beak shapes are specializing on different types of food. So it could be seeds or it could be nuts. And so he said, seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this archipelago, one species had been taken and modified for different ends. The idea here is that there was one species of ancestral type of finch that eventually got dispersed to all of the different islands. All of the different islands have their own food resources available that would require different handling and beak shape and beak size. And through evolutionary time, each finch on each island adapted to its food resources, and therefore beak shape changed, and so did beak size. And then finally, selective breeding. Darwin himself was a selective breeder of pigeons. He loved to breed domestic pigeons, and breeders of domestic animals have created many new types by breeding parents with traits that they wanted to keep. And here we have an example of the rock pigeon or the rock dove. It's the common pigeon that you see in cities. This is what we call the wild type, the unaltered natural state of the rock dove. But selective breeding can bring out different traits that is in the genome of the rock dove, but just not expressed. So here we have an example of the nape pigeon. Perhaps you wanted a grayer pigeon. You would do selective breeding for the offspring to be grayer. Perhaps you wanted a pigeon with buggier eyes. Then you would get the Hungarian shortbeaker. Doesn't it look funny? Perhaps you wanted something that looked more regal with a crown of feathers along its head. Then you would get the Jacobin. Or you can get something that looks like it has a fur coat on with the old Dutch capuchin. But the point being that all of these different types originally came from the same ancestral parent. Now, we also are familiar with selective breeding in the case of dog breeds. Here we have all of the different dog breeds that are recognized by the American Kennel Club. Perhaps some of you during Thanksgiving time watch the dog shows. I know I really love to. And so they have very strict classification guidelines on what makes a breed a specific breed. But you'll notice that we're not calling these breeds species. All of these dog breeds are still encapsulated by one species, and that's the domestic dog. Even though they look very dissimilar, some cases, Great Dane versus a little Chihuahua, they're still the same species, meaning they can interbreed freely. We call this phenomenon ring species. And dogs are my go-to example for ring species, where even though they look very, very different from each other, they're still considered the same species. And we can talk about that even when we talk about our furry friends at home who are still descendants from wolves, even though they might be the most pitiful, spoiled, and lazy things on the planet. Let's talk a little bit about the influences on Charles Darwin. First, we need to talk about Charles Lyell. He wrote Principles of Geology in 1830. This is one of the go-to touchstone works in geological literature that is still referred to by geologists today, and he is considered the father of modern geology. He first proposed the principle of uniformitarianism. And this is the idea that geological features from the distant past can be explained by reference to geological processes now in operation and thus directly observable. You may have heard before, the present is the key to the past. And that is perfectly encapsulating the idea of the principle of uniformitarianism. We can observe processes happening today and just apply that to times in the past. And then also he proposed geological time. And this is key when we're understanding biological evolution. And this is the idea that geological features are the outcome of gradual processes over huge expanses of time. And we've already talked about geological time in the context of the cosmic calendar and understanding how things happen over millennia and billions of years. We also talk about Thomas Malthus. And his idea was first put forth in the essay on the principle of population, published in 1798. It's interesting because he was an economist. And so he looked at the world a little bit differently than a naturalist or a biologist would. But he understood that population growth always threatens to overwhelm the available food supply. This can go for humans, this could go for populations in the wild as well. And he understood that organisms produce far more offspring than can actually survive in the environment. And this is the idea here with time that moves forward and food production remaining steady. If you increase that population, you're eventually going to hit a point where those two lines meet. And once you exceed that point, it could be the human population or it can be an animal population, there's no more food to support that population. And so he was a political economist who in 1798 predicted that humans will go through a food shortage. We would grow faster than food production would, eventually leading to a struggle for resources and ultimate starvation for a lot of people. So this is especially at the forefront of our minds now, especially when it comes to climate change and understanding resources, geopolitics, and climate refugees. Moving on, let's try to encapsulate what we were talking about with natural selection with a few key points, knowing what we know now. So number one, we understand that organisms produce far more offspring than can survive. And we glean that insight from Malthus's work. Number two, individuals vary in their attributes and ability to avoid early death due to starvation, disease, and predation. Number three, probably the most important, only survivors reproduce. And the ability to survive and reproduce is what we call fitness. So it doesn't have to do with how agile you are or how much you can eat in a day or how big your muscles are. It has to do with how much you can survive and reproduce during your lifetime. Number four, if traits are heritable, then the next generation should consist of more resistant, more resilient offspring. And this directly comes from observations on pigeon breeding. And number five, Over geological time, natural selection results in new and better adapted forms of life. And this is pulling straight from the idea of geological time from Charles Lyell. So here's a question for you. Natural selection acts on what? Well, if you are at all familiar with Pokemon, you would be under the impression that natural selection happens at the individual level. But that is not the case. Only if you're a Pokemon do you evolve at an individual level. The question is then, at what level does natural selection act? So we know it's not individual. Species, population, community. Some people even think about the gene. It is widely accepted that natural selection happens on the population level. So discrete groups or populations of organisms will have their own stressors and natural selection drivers, therefore promoting speciation. So natural selection acts on the population level. We often hear this term, survival of the fittest. We need to ask the question, what does this actually mean? And unfortunately, this word has been taken and stolen for not good uses, especially when we're talking about eugenics. So we need to straight away identify what we mean by survival of the fittest. As we said, over time, this phrase has been twisted and appropriated to be associated with things that are very far removed from its original definition. Fittest does not mean that you have the most offspring. Actually, critters with bad genes can often outproduce critters with what we would consider good genes. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Idiocracy. That is a good example for the second point there. Let's talk about the publication of these ideas put forth by Darwin in his book. So he finally publishes his work. It didn't happen quickly. He, remember, did that long voyage when he was younger. He didn't publish on the origin of species until much older in his life. Darwin was a classic and crippling perfectionist. He also knew that publishing his ideas would probably be considered highly offensive and heretical to the religious society of which he was a part. It's often noted that his wife Emma was devoutly religious and probably spoke in his ear multiple times about how he just cannot proceed with publishing his ideas. But then stumbles in this character called A.R. Wallace, and he's the guy on the right with the awesome hat. Where was Wallace? He was in the Amazon River Basin first, but his famous work really happened in the Malay Archipelago. If you notice here, we have this thing called the Wallace Line. So clearly he was influential in ideas of biogeography. But what does this mean? Here's a cute representation of the Wallace Line. And this is a line that essentially separates two different types of faunal communities. It represents a biogeographical faunal transition zone with underpinnings in the breakup of the supercontinent Gondwana after the breakup of Pangaea. So we have different organisms and different types of species on the Asian side, which is mainly on the northwest. And then we have species that are exclusively found on the Australasian side in the south. So Wallace sort of caught wind of what Darwin was talking about in terms of evolution. And so Wallace wrote to Darwin, begging him to read about his idea that he had when he made his field observations. And unfortunately, the ideas that Wallace had were very, very similar to Darwin's. And Darwin wrote a letter about it. He was not very excited. He wrote a letter directly to Charles Lyell, and he was not pleased. This was kind of the pushing point to get Darwin on the ball to actually publishing. And so Alfred Russel Wallace, he wrote this to Charles Darwin. it occurred to me to ask the question, why do some die and some live? And the answer was clearly, on the whole, the best fitted live. And considering the amount of individual variation that my experience as a collector has shown me to exist, then it followed that all the changes necessary for the adaptation of the species to the changing conditions would be brought about. In this way, every part of an animal's organization could be modified exactly as required, and in the very process of this modification, the unmodified would die out, and thus the definite characters and the clear isolation of each new species would be explained. So as you can imagine, Darwin read this and he was probably pulling his hair out like, oh, I've had these ideas for so long. Why didn't I publish them? I'm going to be scooped. So there was the idea of co-publishing, and they actually did co-publish. They published the first paper on natural selection together, but I bet you've never heard of Alfred Russel Wallace. And I didn't either until I got to graduate school. So why does Darwin get all of the credit? Well, Darwin's name came first. Wallace was very modest and he didn't want to take all of the credit, which he probably should have prodded a little bit more, but he didn't want to step on anyone's toes. Wallace became a minister later in life and he actually stopped doing science. So this probably wasn't big on his priority list in terms of what he got credit for. And then we can probably just chalk it up to a combination of all three. We're all humans, we all do weird things. Sometimes we get different lots in life, and this is how we learn about Wallace, a footnote in history. So finally, the origin of species. Wallace figuring out his life's work separately scared Darwin enough that he hurried up and wrote the abstract to his specific scientific study. This ended up being a massive 400+ page book called The Origin of Species, published in 1859. And I don't know if you read it, it's very interesting. It is a long read and it's written in old prose, so it's kind of hard to get through. In addition to the scientific jargon, it's also just not written in a modern form of English that we speak today. But importantly, in it, he predicted the existence of transitional fossils. And this is the greatest testament to the predictive power of evolution. We've already talked about one of the key transitional fossils in Tiktaalik, but here's another one. And this was discovered just a few years after Origin of Species was published. And I don't know if you've heard of this or seen this before, but it's called Archaeopteryx. And this is important because it is considered the transitional fossil between dinosaurs and what we know today as their modern descendants of birds. You can clearly see the wing imprints here, the feathers impeccably, pristinely preserved. Let's talk about whales. Whales are descended from land animals. But the question is, how do we test this? We know that they have different characteristics here. They're related closely to our modern day dolphins. But how do we test the hypothesis that they are related to land animals? Well, first thing we've already talked about last week is the idea of homology. We can directly compare their bone structures and their functions to other living relatives and even those in the fossil record to identify homologous structures. In addition to homology, I'm going to introduce a new concept here, and that is vestigial parts. Vestigial means a vestige, or hearkening back to an older time where things and situations were different. Vestigial parts exist in animals all around us and even ourselves. These represent organs or parts that are no longer used or needed, and therefore have been greatly reduced, so much so that they're not functional. They don't serve any clear purpose or role other than perhaps to make us sick in the case of the human appendix. And it's thought that the appendix is one of those vestigial organs that has been left over and is a relic of our evolutionary past. And as I said, sometimes it just needs to be removed because it's not doing us any good. And the worst case is it's actually causing us harm. Something that I didn't appreciate until I was much older is that snakes have rudimentary legs. Here, if you overturn a snake and you look next to its cloaca, or the hole through which it pees and defecates, you can see these little claw-like things. Those are considered vestigial legs. They're a relic of when the snake, as a lineage, was walking on land. Another wonderful vestigial part are the pelvis, ischium, and femur inside of the whale. So obviously, whales don't have legs, but their ancestors walked on land and they did have legs. Once whales entered the sea and began a marine lifestyle, they no longer needed those back limbs. They eventually reduced so much throughout the course of their evolution that they became completely concealed inside of the body, but you can still, upon dissection, find parts of the leg bones inside of a whale. It is fascinating. Another thing to consider doesn't have to do with body parts, but mode of lifestyle or reproduction. And so we can turn to another sea-going creature, the shark, and ask, how does it give birth? Okay, so we're interested not in body parts, but lifestyles. We understand that sharks give birth tail first. Sharks are not closely related to whales. They are instead cartilaginous fishes. So they're more closely related to fishes than they are to whales. And we understand that they give birth tail first. And this is an image of giving birth to a shark pup. I tried to find videos online, but they give birth so quickly, I couldn't find a good one. So the question is, if whales are descended from land animals, how would you expect them to be born? Head first or tail first? Think about how humans are born. We live in an environment with oxygen around us, and we need to breathe because we're land creatures. We don't have gills, we have lungs. So why is it helpful to be born head first as a human? Probably because we need to start taking our first gulps of air as soon as we exit the womb. Next, why are sharks and other fish who have live birth born tail first? Well, they don't need air to live. Instead, it makes sense for them to propel themselves out of their mother's womb with their tail. And so that is perhaps why the sharks and other fish who have live birth are born tail first and not head first. So the question is, how are whales born? They live in the sea. They also need to propel themselves out of their mother's womb, but whales give birth head first. That doesn't make any sort of sense until you realize and appreciate the evolutionary history of whales is that they descended from ancestors that lived on land. Here we have fossil evidence that is housed at the University of Michigan Museum of Paleontology. We are seeing the inside of a whale mother's womb. Here is the opening through which she gives birth, and inside in blue is the whale fetus. And we notice that the whale fetus is positioned with the head first, which is just fascinating. So not only can we tell with homologous features and organs, vestigial organs and parts, we can also tell through mode of childbearing that whales are descendant from land creatures. And fun fact, whales are most closely related to modern day hippos. Isn't that the coolest? So this all can be summed up with descent with modification. Darwin suggested that species change through time and that all organisms are related. He used branches on a tree of life as a metaphor, but he actually never used the word evolution in the origin of species. He only called it descent with modification. Let's talk about, just quickly, some misconceptions of evolution. We're not saying that evolution always leads to more and more advanced organisms. So the assumption here is that we're going from a very primitive form to a more advanced form in Homer Simpson. But the real point is that if all of these creatures were living at the very same point in time, all of them are equally as evolved as the other. And this is not an accurate depiction of evolution. Evolution does not happen along a chain from lower to higher. Evolution happens by splitting and following the split both ways. And both of the organisms at the end of those splits are equally as adapted and equally as fit. All species that are alive today have equal lengths of time to adapt to their environments. This means that there's no such thing as a primitive species. If you're alive today, you are equally as evolved, meaning I'm just as evolved as the microbes that are living on my teeth as biofilms. One species can, of course, be more competitively successful than another in the same environment, but it is not more evolved if it is alive for the same amount of time. And Darwin put it this way: it is absurd to talk of one animal being higher than another. That being said, women wrote to Darwin to ask him what he thought of men and women being equally evolved. And he rejected the notion women had evolved to work in the home and were not suited for science. So scientists are often very ignorant of their own biases, even when it is clearly against their scientific findings. And I'll say this again and again: science as a tool is the best way we can navigate and answer questions about our world. But science as an enterprise is wrought with ego, biases, and we can do so much better. Saying evolution is just a theory is just not robust. Evolution is a theory, but laws and theories are equally supported by the data. So an example is the theory of gravity, and the laws of planetary motion are all supported by equally valid data. I don't see people questioning the theory of gravity. However, biological evolution gets questioned all of the time. So we can sum this up by saying evolution is both fact and theory.